Hello all, Old Geek here again, and in this video I'm going to try and give some advice on creating a sandbox. Sort of a sandbox. Focusing on how I've attempted to do it myself and why. So, I hope you find what I say useful. Let's dive in. Firstly, I do need to define the term. What is a sandbox? Essentially, it refers to a style of game where the players and their characters drive the action. They have the freedom to go where they like, when they like, and how they like. The world goes on around them, and the characters' actions have varying degrees of direct and indirect influence on that world. Any story thus emerges through the actions of the players, as little or nothing is defined beforehand. It is incredibly difficult to run a game as a pure sandbox though, as it's impossible to prepare for all eventualities. And for this type of game to work, the group must be highly proactive. Players need to be consistent in their approach, and the DM needs to be both highly organised and extremely skilled in improvising. Skills that I'm guessing most of us don't have to that necessary degree. It's not a style of play that suits everybody. It's very hard to keep it up consistently, but in my experience, when you get it right, it's vastly more satisfying than a game based on a more defined sequence of events. But also, as a DM, you need to be aware that hiccups will be frequent, which I suppose makes the good bits even more memorable. So, how did I run a sandbox? Firstly, an admission. My game was not a pure sandbox in its most extreme form. I cheated. And the result was that the game had the illusion of being more sandboxy than it actually was. Who cares, though, if the players don't notice? From the very beginning, you need a foundation and some inspiration. You need to decide the tone of your game. My game was fairly typical fantasy, just how I like it, medieval in tone. I was using AD&D 2nd edition with very few of the add-ons. It's a rule set I'm fluent with, keeping largely to core rules and ignoring much of the later splat that bogged it down. So that's really tip 1. Reduce the potential burden of complexity. You will need the room to create and to improvise. And for inspiration, I like mythology, and I decided to plunder aspects of the stories and the tone of Old England, those of Gaelic and Celtic myth. So essentially it was like a medieval England type setting, but with a bit of the feel of Druidic times and pre-Roman times. I also like dark music, and I thought it would be different to base aspects of the game on the lyrics of a band whose music I enjoy, and whose lyrics go into suitably mystical themes, and that band was the Fields of the Nephilim. If you like self-indulgent, moody, gothic rock, then check them out. They're very good. So, with that basic inspiration and grounding sort of in place, and they needed to be to begin with, the next part was the basic idea for the game world. Again, you have to keep the foundations simple. I went for the Lost Continent approach. A blank canvas, only burdened by whatever lore you want to create. I decided that all PCs will have been displaced from their homeland, by some form of cataclysm. Didn't need to go into too many details. They then spent months on the high seas and landed on a new world. This ensured that the population of that new world was generally fit and healthy and of a working age. Being the initial settlers on the world, they will have helped to create new villages, with the population being boosted by more refugees arriving over time. Thus, other ideas will be being brought into the world. And they will have had also brought aspects of their own society's religion and customs with them. This sets a pattern for life in the game world, and it gives the PCs a degree of importance in their fledgling society, which does help in terms of the game decision making. It makes their decisions feel more important. In a typical fantasy game, you usually need a pantheon of gods because you have clerics. I decided to make my own and to keep it fairly simple. Nothing like the lists of 20 or 30 gods that Forgotten Realms and Greyhawk had. I use alignment, so I made one deity for each alignment and logically linked their fields to the tenets of those alignments. Chaotic neutral, quite logically, would be weather, storms, and the sea. Neutral good, motherhood, fertility, agriculture, and so on. And when it came to names, I simply typed words that were applicable to what each deity represented into an online translator. Modern English into Old English, or Modern English into various forms of Gaelic. And I took whatever I felt to be most apt for the name of a deity from the suggestions that were given. I swapped a few letters about to make them trip off the tongue a little better, but that's how I came up with the names. It also helped get the feel of the world that I wanted. I did also create several Old World deities based on old Irish and Gaelic myth, but these were dormant, ready to be awoken, because I had ideas of the back history of this new world. I didn't tell the players about those. The idea was that they would come out during play. Next up was a map. A simple sketch of the local area, on which I placed a couple of small refugee settlements, with the rest being wild terrain. For this, I selected a small piece of the west coast of Wales, flipped it 180 degrees vertically, and used that as my basis. There is no need to create a detailed world map at the very beginning, because when the game starts, you can then add bits and pieces to your map as you go along. This is why I began with a map that was inspired by the real world. Geographical integrity is important. It is much easier to improvise and develop on a map when you have a framework that is logical and grounded in a familiar form of reality. And that is probably the single biggest piece of advice I can offer in terms of the general feeling of the game. If you keep most of it grounded, keep most of the nuts and bolts grounded in a degree of reality, then you can develop and improvise from there much, much more easily. You don't tie yourself in knots as much. I then wrote a very basic introductory scenario, which was based on my initial work. But before that could start, we needed the PCs. So I spoke to a couple of the players beforehand, those I could get in touch with, and went through the basics of character creation with them to save a little bit of time. But we left a lot of the details out. The rest of the players came to the session and I gave them blank character sheets. I then explained which classes and races would be available for them to play. The only playable races at the start would be humans and halflings, as they were the ones that I said were on the refugee boats. The key here is that the other races, I wanted them to already exist on this new continent, and I wanted the players to think about how they would be approached in order to foster relations with them. And if their trust was gained during the game, then they would become playable options for future characters. Hang on. Limiting options? Surely Sandbox games are all about freedom. Yes, they are. But they're all about freedom of action within the game world. I don't subscribe to the melting pot that is the Forgotten Realms. I find it an awkward and unrealistic mess. It lacks that real-world logic. And as I've already said, in order to consistently and logically improvise to a good standard, the world has to make sense. Keeping the initial society based in a simpler pseudo-reality would make it easier for me to allow more freedom of action within that game world. Plus there is one other thing. I did want to adjust some aspects of the traditional fantasy races. But again, that's something I kept from the players. While they were making characters, I gave the players the background regarding how they had got there, the names and roles of a couple of pre-created NPCs, and a basic map of their local area, though with a few details missing. And I asked them to think about what their character had done in order to help their people build their settlements and establish their community. And with that done, I told them it was a fine spring morning, start role-playing. And I just sat back and I made notes. I expected this might fill 20, maybe 30 minutes of play, but it went on, and I made more notes. Especially when I dropped the initial seed for the introductory scenario that I had written, which did fire up the role-playing and got them going a bit more frenetically. After about 2 hours, they had made up their own backgrounds, motives, professions, notable NPCs, and named some people and places. In essence, they had helped flesh out that starting village. They had created for me a devoted priestess who was the girlfriend of the party's cleric, a bedraggled, drunk captain of the guard who hated his job, shopkeepers who disliked the priesthood, trying to use their status to get discounts, and so on. All of these became seeds for future adventures, and all of these were created by the players themselves. It was now that I started fleshing out those villages a lot more, adding more detail to the game world, more personality to the deities and to their worshippers. I built on the NPC ideas and was able to plan out the framework of a number of possible adventures. And the vast majority of this came from that initial role-playing session, the end of what really was our session 0. It gave me a lot of the ideas, which were the seeds from which I built. Now that campaign ran successfully for quite a while, but it did grind to a halt when our host's personal circumstances changed, and one of my other players bought Horror on the Orient Express for Call of Cthulhu, which was extremely shiny and distracted us away from D&D for a while. Now, earlier on in the video, I mentioned the concept of illusion of choice. You see, all along, I had some idea of where I wanted everything to end up. Also, my personal time can often be a little limited. I have multiple jobs, so I sometimes only had one plot hook properly developed. What I did was I learnt to drop certain nuggets into the game at opportune moments, as I knew what was driving each character, so I had an idea of what threads they would be most likely to follow. Thus, while they were indeed making important decisions and influencing key outcomes, I was nudging them in the direction that I wanted. And a lot of these decisions and outcomes were based on things that had happened in earlier sessions, things that the players had done in earlier sessions. Other things I would do would be to foreshadow excess danger. I'd throw in interesting NPCs and some intriguing items, all with the view of just guiding their choices a little towards the way I wanted them to go. Plus, of course, there were a few encounters that they were going to have, no matter which way they went. And some adventure sites got relocated, more than once. I've already touched on a number of the pros and cons of this style of gaming, but it's worth just summarising them here. The pros: it is flexible. It gives the players a tangible role in the creation of the game world. If they grasp that, then they create ready-made hooks for you, the DM, to exploit and develop. But you need the right type of group for it to work. It's good for confident, proactive role players. It suits DMs who are also comfortable and confident with improvising. But that can be made easier if you follow my tips from earlier about keeping everything simple and grounded. But this style isn't for everyone. So these are some of the cons. Many gamers do like to follow pre-existing stories in worlds with familiar, detailed lore. Then they can feel a little bit lost if they're not being led by the hand. This type of game exists. There are plenty of them about, and it's not a problem. It's not my style of play, but it is the style of play of quite a few often newer gamers. Gamers that lean towards a very wham-bam style of play are likely to get frustrated, as there does tend to be more exploration and more roleplay in this style of game. The players also must have firm trust in the DM, and the DM must trust the players to be consistent with their characters and to respect the game world. Otherwise, the whole experience will be utterly frustrating. Anyway, I think that's enough for this video. I hope you found it useful, interesting maybe. Happy gaming!